Okay, so we're in the middle of the Rav Kook on Halacha Aleph. So in the 5th chapter, Halacha Aleph, the Rambam starts talking about the laws that Shmita produce can only be eaten and drinking, and for oil you can rub it into your skin, and you could light use it for a fuel for your lights, and you can use it for dyeing objects, for dyeing, your clothes, things like that. And we learned, according to the Torah Shabbal Peh, that the Shmita produce tia it will be shows that you're allowed to light a candle and to use it for dyeing purposes. So basically, the halacha is because Shmita produce is given to us to eat, so it's eaten for and as we started saying last week, it's basically you can only use Shmita produce for its highest and best use. So and normal use. So in Halacha Beis, we'll just read it again. So how is it for eating and drinking? You could eat something that's normally eaten. You could drink something that's normally drink, just like Truma and Meiser Sheni. And I think we saw this. Yeah, these halachas go together. And you're not allowed to change fruits from the way they grew, or produce the way it grew, just like you can't change Truma produce, which is the tithe to the Kohen, or Meiser Sheni, which is the second tithe, which we have to eat in Yerushalayim. And we mentioned that there are some similarities between Shmita and these things for other halachos in regard to the fact that they have sanctity, and that the sanctity could be transferred by money. Well, not really for Truma, but Meiser Sheni, if it's too much to bring your stuff to Yerushalayim to eat it, you can redeem it on a minted coin, and the sanctity goes onto the money. And we also learned that when you sell Shmita produce, the sanctity gets transferred onto money. So these items all have elements of sanctity. Something that you usually eat raw, you're not allowed to eat it cooked. Something that you usually eat it cooked, you're not allowed to eat it raw. Therefore, you cannot boil animal food, because animals eat their food raw. And you can't eat something that a cooked dish that had gone bad, or moldy bread that had not moldy or whatever, however it became no good. Just like you're not allowed to eat that for Truma and Meiser. So other halachas, which we will probably see also, but olives in those days, it doesn't seem that they were eaten raw too often, and they weren't eaten cooked. They used oil to rub it in their skin. So we already saw a little bit about, we mentioned last week, remember, Mike, we said that you can't break in your new baseball glove using Shmita olive oil. So it could only be used for human consumption, and in a normal way it would be consumed. So I mentioned the example last week, and Rav Kook was mentioning many examples. Europeans, Ramosha mentions that his father never ate raw carrots. Europeans only had boiled carrots. Let's say it was in a tzimis or something. So, if the whole world was like that from pre-war Europe, it wouldn't have been allowed to eat a raw carrot. Or another thing is, probably it wouldn't be allowed to eat a raw onion, because most people don't eat onions raw. However, red onions, or the shallot, the green onions that people put it raw into a salad or stuff, that is normally eaten raw, so you would be allowed to eat that raw. So we're in the middle of Rav Kook's discussion on these halachas. So if you had Shmita wine that fell into some type of salve, they made some type of ointment as a medicine type thing, you would need to destroy it, because now that the wine is in there, that's certainly not the highest and best use for the wine. So it is prohibited to receive any benefit from it. So normally the Shmita produce you really could only eat. Oil, so the Rambam says from the word tia, it will be, so there's certain things that they're not usually eaten. So olive oil is used as fuel for your candles or your lamps, and it was also rubbed into the skin. So that's the normal use. Certain things that they use for dyes, you could use it as a dye. But in general, so this wine fell into this ointment or whatever, to rub wine into something is not the normal way. So you couldn't use it at all. And also wine that fell into, you're allowed to put dried figs or dates into a cooked dish, just like you would put spices, but you can't squeeze them to make drinks. But spices, he says the tavlin means spices. Now our spices are all dry, but he's saying that I guess there were spices that they used to squeeze out. So the stuff that you usually would squeeze out, and that's the way you used it as a spice, that would be allowed. So, we brought up the point last week about, some people have pomegranate juice or cherry juices or things like that, things that are, that most people don't drink. You wouldn't be allowed to make those juice. You wouldn't be allowed to juice those things for Shmita purposes. Even, carrots and stuff like that, there are people, I'm mentioning that because on the streets of Yerushalayim, you could find these, juicing stands, and they would have stuff like that. But if it was a Shmita carrot, if it would be allowed, my guess is probably not. And you can't use the wine to make certain types of things that were usually given for medical purposes, because when you have it as a medical thing, even though you drink it, you would normally drink wine plain, not mixed up with these other herbs and roots and stuff. Things that you're allowed to use, things that are fit for human consumption, you're allowed to make them into like an ointment for medicinal purposes. And it appears that you're not allowed to use Shmita wine that's mixed up with leaves of something called china, because that is also a medicinal thing. But you're allowed to mix wine and honey and pepper and eat it together. So I guess it's some type of mead, I guess. But that was something that was a common way of drinking it. Now, nowadays, that's not a common way of drinking it. So my guess is you probably would not be allowed to do it. You're not allowed to cook Shmita wine because you are going to reduce it. So there's an idea of we know that the Chachamim forbade us to use wine that was touched by a non-Jew, because we were worried, especially in the time when the non-Jews were pagans, which most non-Jews today around here are not pagans. But with the suspicion was that if they would have wine, they would, dump the cup a little bit as an offering to, one of their gods or multiple of their gods. So even though most of the around us aren't pagans like that, but they said non-Jew who touches wine, doesn't matter if it's a pagan or not pagan. So that was the halacha. So a way to get around that is if we have yain mevushal, if the wine got boiled, it's a lower quality, so they wouldn't give something like that to their god because it's not the highest quality. And there is a machlokas, I think we mentioned it, I think at Pesach, in our Reb Sachem, that there is an opinion that the Rambam actually holds like that for Kiddush, you have to use wine that's not mevushal, because you're not allowed to use yain mevushal, boiled wine, on the Mizbeach when you have to bring wine libations with korbanos. And there's an opinion, the Rambam passes like it, but the Shulchan Aruch doesn't, that you wouldn't be allowed to use yain mevushal for Kiddush, because Kiddush has to be used with something that you could put on the Mizbeach. And there is a discussion, some companies, or many companies, so some of the nicer wines, you have to look at every label. Just because it's kosher, it doesn't mean it's mevushal unless it says mevushal on the label. So a lot of the nicer wines that I've heard are not mevushal at all. And then there are a lot of wines that they're not actually boiled to 212, but they're pasteurized, or flash pasteurized. So they get up to, 187 or something like that. So some people say that that's good enough for mevushal, but from the fact that they're willing to do that, but not worse, because they don't want to ruin the quality of the wine, shows that it's not really getting worse. So the opinion of the position of the Badats in Yerushalayim, which is known as the highest standard, if the wine was mevushal by pasteurization, they only write mavushal ayadei pistor, which in Hebrew is for boiled through pasteurization. So for people who hold you need 212, it's not enough. So people could, they won't let non-Jews touch it. Once Ramosha said that there was a group that included new age, hippie types coming for something, and Rav Aaron told his wife, "Quick, go boil the wine." I think they were coming for a Sheva Brachos or a wedding or something. So he was worried that some of them weren't Jewish and this and that. So, and the wine wasn't mavushal. So that's the last time I ever heard of actually someone putting wine into a pot to boil it to make it mavushal. Michelob. To what? It's not the same thing. Right. So there, I could imagine that there are people who go, but it's. I mean, so one way to get around it is, so we had, where Shiloh came up in my parents' house about 30 years ago, when a lot of people were coming from the former Soviet Union. And, we knew that because of their, how terrible the communists were, there was a lot of Jews marrying non-Jews. And so we were having families over for the Seder, and we knew that, that the husband wasn't Jewish or this or that. So, yeah, no, I'm saying this is the first time that no, I'm not, there's plenty of unfortunately, plenty of intermarriage here also, but that's where the Shiloh came up. And so we used only mavushal wine, but then my father or my mother were the only ones who poured the wine anyway. So if there's things where there's other people there, but just, can I pour you the wine? And then you don't have to worry about anyone touching it, even if it is mavushal. But there is an opinion that you're allowed to boil the wine, even though that you make it a little bit, even though there's less of a quantity, but the mavushal is a little bit better and it lasts longer. So he talks about this later. Okay, so this is something that Marty was mentioning, because 2 months ago in volume number 9 of the CRC thing, Rabbi Reese was writing about this laws of Shmita wine. So Rav Kook says it's fitting to point out here that you shouldn't, if you're using Shmita produce wine, you shouldn't fill. So there's a custom to overflow the Havdalah cup, that the bracha should overflow, but as a simon bracha. So you shouldn't do that, because you're causing it to be lost, to be wasted. And so also in the 4 cups, when on Pesach, when you spill out a little for Ditzach Hadash B'Achav, you take out with your finger, whatever. And it seems any mitzvah that needs a kos, so that because the Yerushalmi and Shkalim says you're allowed to fulfill your mitzvah with Shmita wine. So it seems every mitzvah that needs a kos, like Kiddush and Havdalah, there's no problem of making mitzvahs bundles. So I don't know what he means here, but the Ramban's opinion is that there's a mitzvah to eat Shmita produce. So you might think that you can't use Shmita wine for a mitzvah. I mean, that doesn't seem to be what he's saying, but I don't know how else to explain it, because you don't want to make mitzvahs as a bundle, because it looks like you're cheapening mitzvahs, that you just want to get it over with. So you should do each mitzvah, be happy with mitzvah number 1, and then go to mitzvah number 2, and then go to mitzvah number 3. Okay, a very strange comment here. That's not what I thought he was going to say, but he does say about overflowing the cup, not overflowing the cup. because you're causing the Shmita wine to be wasted. Now, nowadays that a lot of people have trays underneath it, if you overflow it, but then you can pour it back in and drink it. So is it considered wasting? I guess it's still not necessarily the best thing to do. You're not allowed to make pickled onions with vinegar that was Shmita vinegar, because you're going to have to eventually lose the vinegar, even though it improves the onions. The fact that you're using the vinegar for this purpose, it's not the highest and best use for the vinegar. Now, what's the highest and best use for vinegar? I'm not sure. It certainly is an important thing, but not to make pickled onions, I guess. Rav Kook says. Certainly, you're not allowed to make pickled onions with Shmita vinegar if you used even non-Shmita onions. Because onions can last a long time. So you had onions from the 6th year, and vinegar. So in his day, they were talking about wine vinegar. So I mean, I don't know, again, with how the bior would work, the bior, when you had to get rid of the Shmita produce, how long did you have wine that you were able to get vinegar from it? I don't know, unless he's talking about, according to the Ramban's opinion that we follow, that after you declared it ownerless, you could take it back. But the thing is, the way that we can temporarily make vinegar by boiling grains or distilling it, whatever, that probably wouldn't be the highest and best use. So they probably wouldn't be allowed to distill alcohol from Shmita produce either. You cannot mix produce or bean type things together, but you can mix sesames with lentil beans, because the produce, when I say produce here, I mean grains. Grains and beans, you can't separate them that well. Once they're mixed together, you're going to have a mix. But sesames from I think these lentils, you can use a sieve or a sift or whatever to separate them very well. So anything that you can that easily separated like that, you're able to mix them up. But I only think, says Rav Kook, that that's talking about lentil type or bean type things that are the same size as a grain, that you can't separate them. Then you're not allowed to mix them up to begin with. But things that have different sizes to begin with, that if you would, sift them, they would separate, you're allowed to combine them. So when I was doing the granular physics research, so one of the ways that we were able to save money on material, to save money on materials, we used a lot of food-based grains instead of buying glass beads or this or that. So one thing that we did, we used coriander and salt. And we had a gazillion different things. We had it for a whole shaker table. There were like 20 different things. We didn't, but it was very easy for me to sift them apart after we did an experiment and then reuse it again. So you're not allowed to mix stuff together that you wouldn't be able to separate either, because I guess grains, the best use is to mill it into flour or whatever, and beans not necessarily. But if it's easily siftable or that you could separate it, then there's not a problem. From the opinion of the Minchas Bikurim, in the 10th parak of Truma, it appears that sesames with lentils you're allowed to combine, even if you cannot separate them well through a sieve. And when Yehuda was destroyed, they used to mix grain with other produce and beans with different beans, but they wouldn't mix grain with beans and not beans with produce. Okay, the way that you would sift the flour the rest of the year, you're also allowed to do that on Shmita, that you're allowed to sift it and then throw away the bran. So for those who didn't want the high bran bread, it's not a problem to get rid of the bran the regular way you would do it the rest of the years of the Shmita cycle. The fact that you're allowed to throw away the bran is only if you sift it the way that the majority of people do it. You don't have to keep the bran, which is considered like a waste product. But if you wanted to make super high quality fine flour, so you're going to lose a lot more than the average person would sift, then you're not allowed to throw out the rest, because that is normally eaten for it's used, that stuff is fit for human consumption. So he says you have to keep it safe, but also obviously if you're not going to eat it, you can give it to someone else who will eat it, but you can't throw it out. So that's another thing that we've mentioned before, that Shmita produce, let's say you have a little bit left over from your plate, you can't just throw it out. So people have a special Shmita bucket, and you have to wait a few days till it would start spoiling, and then you're allowed to throw it out, because once it's spoiled, then you could throw it out, but we can't throw it out before it's spoiled. Halacha Dalet. You're not allowed to cook a Shmita vegetable with truma oil. So truma is the oil given to a Kohen. Now nowadays, we're not sure that people who are Kohen are really a Kohen, so we don't let them eat truma for their own good, because if someone who's not really a Kohen who eats truma, they get a heavenly death sentence. But theoretically, or in the time that we still allowed Kohanim to eat the truma, you couldn't fry vegetables, make your stir fry with truma oil if you were a Kohen, because we don't want it to become puzzle. So there's a machlokas you shown him. So if you only cooked a little bit and you ate it immediately, it's permitted, because you haven't let them to become disqualified. So some people say that the reason is truma is not allowed to become impure. So if you would have a large quantity of Shmita food that was mixed with truma, so now it has a taste of Shmita produce, sanctity of Shmita and sanctity of truma. If it would become tummy, you'd have to dispose of the Shmita food, and it's going to be lost, and we don't want it to be lost. We want it to be consumed. So that's the Rambam's opinion. So if you're only going to make a little bit that you're going to eat it right away, we're not worried that you're going to become tummy or it's going to become impure. You're going to have a mouse run through it right away. We're not worried about that, so that's okay. Other opinions seem to say that the reason is, I think we saw this when we learned the Mishnayos, that the reason is because you're going to cause the truma to be lost, because when whatever vegetables that you were frying here are no longer in the field, you have to do biur, and you have to get rid of them. So, and according to the Rambam's opinion, you literally have to burn them, and so you would be causing truma to be wasted also. So Rav Kook says the Kesef Mishnah on this halacha, which again is the commentary on the Rambam written by the author of the Shulchan Aruch, says that you allow ab initio, you're allowed to cook a little bit to eat it immediately. Meaning the Rambam says if you made a little bit and you ate it allowed, it's allowed. But it doesn't say that you're allowed to. He said if you did it, it's okay, but not that you should. But the Kesef Mishnah says no, you're allowed to do it, to cook a little bit, and it's not a problem. But you're not allowed to leave it over, even though immediately you intended to eat it a lot. So you were really hungry, you made a big stir fry, and then you ate half of it and you're like, yeah, I'm full now. So it's not okay. If you cooked it in the truma oil, you have to finish it. There's a story, I read it years ago. I don't remember the people involved, but somehow, because it's telling a different machlokas, but someone had a bunch of tomatoes, and I think they were Shmita tomatoes, and he left the country, Israel, with it, which is a different thing if you're allowed to export Shmita produce, which actually I just saw on the internet last week that there was a warning put out in England that the grapefruits right now are Shmita produce, and next month, I think it was the grapefruits, after next month, you can't have it at all because it's after the biur time. So, yeah, meaning it was from Israel that's being sold in England. So the Svichen is what the difficult topic that we were dealt with between 2 and 8 or 9 weeks ago, the stuff that well, I don't know why it would be grapefruit would be svichen. Trees weren't svichen, it's vegetables. After maybe I'm misremembering what it said, but there was something, an alert about it that I saw on the internet. Someone quoted. Whatever. So obviously they don't let you bring fruits or vegetables into a different country. So this rabbi ate like 10 tomatoes right there, and someone's like, it's a very unusual thing that you did. Why did you do that? And he said, well, I can't let the Shmita produce go to waste. Okay, halacha hey on the next page. A food or produce or fruits which are fit for human consumption or are always used for human food, you're not allowed to feed them to a domesticated animal, a wild animal, or to birds. If your domesticated animal by itself went under a fig tree and was eating figs, even though figs aren't animal foods, you do not have to shoo it away. Your animal and the wild beast that's in your land, all the produce can be to eat. So if it decides to eat it, it could eat it. So a possible nafkamina here is that we know from watching Mr. Ed and stuff like that is that we do give apples to a horse. So would we not be allowed to give apples to a Shmita apple to a horse? Probably not, because it has Shmita sanctity. Now again, according to the Heter Mechira opinion, it doesn't have sanctity, so give it to a horse. According to the Otzer Beis Din opinion, it does have Kedusha Shviyah, so you wouldn't be allowed to give it to a horse. So obviously, all these halachas about Shmita produce, according to the Heter Mechira, so the Heter Mechira, we've discussed these things many times, but you weren't here, so just so no one is that it's the possibility of selling they sell the top foot or so of the land to a non-Jew, so that it's be considered not owned by a Jew. And if it's not owned by a Jew, well there's the machlokas between Minhag Yerushalayim and Minhag Bnei Brak, but Rav Kook Paskin very forcefully, we saw last week, that we hold that it's not considered sanctified, so it doesn't have any kedusha shviyas. So these halachas that we're talking about now about not wasting, and if the highest and best use, it wouldn't apply to that stuff. Halacha vav l'sicha keitzad. How was Shmita produce given us that we're allowed to rub it into our skin? You're allowed to rub into something that's normally rubbed in. You're not allowed to rub wine or vinegar into your skin because that's not a normal thing. You're allowed to rub oil into your skin, but you're not allowed to make the oil. You're not allowed to put besamim into it so it smells nice. And you're not allowed to rub the oil in if you're in the bathhouse. You could rub outside the bathhouse and then go in. So it seems that it's a little bit disrespectful to treat the Shmita produce to use it in the bathhouse like that. Now, I would think that you would first go to the bath and then rub it into your skin, but I don't know why they did it that way. I guess we need a historian of that. So, so something like aloe plant, aloe is usually rubbed into the skin. So something like that wouldn't be a problem to rub into the skin. But I'm just curious, I know some people use aloe in shakes or whatever they make in yes, but would aloe be I don't know, I'd have to see what they are. My guess is aloe is primarily the laws of Shmita probably wouldn't apply to it, because it's probably not. Some people, it's edible, but it's not usually used as a food. So my guess is that it wouldn't have any Shmita concerns at all. So of course you could rub it into your skin because it's not a food. But so to use the Dead Sea mud onto your skin in Shmita is not a problem. It's not food. But if someone would have some concoction where they would put different oils from different foods, so you probably wouldn't be allowed to make the foods into oils, just like you couldn't juice something that's not usually juiced. But besides the fact that you could make oil, you couldn't probably rub it into your skin either. Okay, so Rav Kook says, even though you're not allowed to make the oil, add, besamim and nice smelling stuff to it, but if you did, you are allowed to rub it in. But wine, you're never allowed to rub the wine, Shmita wine, into your skin, because we don't use wine for rubbing it into your skin. You're allowed to buy perfumed oil on Shmita, even from someone who is not trustworthy to keep the laws of Shmita. And we'll say that the money, we saw this a few weeks ago. So that the sanctity of Shmita produce transfers to money. So we discussed, if you buy from a non-Jew, should you not be allowed to buy Shmita produce from a non-Jew, because the money will get Shmita sanctity, and then we're worried that he's going to do business and buy something from a Jew, and then another Jew is going to unwittingly and unknowingly have money that has Shmita sanctity on it. So we mentioned that, we discussed that a couple weeks ago. So even though someone is not going to treat the money with Kedusha Shvius, you're allowed to buy perfumed oil from them, as long as the person. So there's a difference between someone we know breaks the law, someone we're not sure. So someone we're not sure, you're allowed to, the word he uses, someone who we're not sure if he's trustworthy. But someone who we know is willing to sell Shmita produce and say that it's not Shmita produce, you're not allowed to buy it from that type of person. Now, how do you know the difference between these types of people? I don't know. So it appears that when this oil is from the 6th year, but we have a doubt whether the spices that they use are from the 6th year or from the 7th year. Because if they're from the 7th year, then the spices have Shmita. Since when they're mixed up, you can't see the spices anymore. They were not strict on this. And so meaning Rav Kook says that this heter, that if someone who we're not sure if they're trustworthy, that's only when we know that the oil is not Shmita oil. The only question are the spices from Shmita. So he says in that case you could be lenient, because since they're ground up and then mixed up in the oil and you don't see the spices anymore, so we can be lenient on that because they're not seen anymore. Even though you're not allowed to give money with Shmita sanctity to an Am Haaretz for more than 3 meals, because we're worried that he's going to spend other things and other people will unknowingly have the money. But in this case, the Chachamim did not make such a zera. But if we know that the oil is Shmita oil, it's be the same law of buying any Shmita produce. So when we have, just so you know, in your Ardea, if in your kitchen you would have spices that were treif somehow, or the best day isn't necessarily that they'd be a treif spice, but let's say you got it from a Buddhist or something, and what they do is before they get anything out, they put it in their Buddha statue. So that's something that was given as an offering to an idol, and we're not allowed to use it at all. And you're not even allowed to give it away, because that would be you're getting benefit. It's not just you're not allowed to eat it; you wouldn't be allowed to get any benefit from it. So let's say you had spices like that, and then you made some type of food, and you had used these spices in it. It's not so clear. We wouldn't say in that case that it's nullified the way we would say here, because when the spices are an integral part of the thing, so even though spices in general are you always have more than 60 times the amount of spices in a food, but you put in spices because you don't want them to be nullified. They enhance the thing. So in that type of halacha, we wouldn't rely on something like this. But because this is based on an additional edict that the Chazal made about not giving money for Shmita produce to someone who's not going to treat it with the proper sanctity, this was a rare enough case that they didn't make such an edict in this case. So it's not They're not analogous. You're allowed to put oil on top of a wound, but that's when you put it on the wound itself, just like you're putting it over the rest of your skin. But you can't take, meaning if I don't know exactly how they did it, but let's say you would pour some oil into your skin and just rub it there. So if that's what you're doing, you can do that also. But you couldn't use some type of dropper. I forget the exact, or maybe even let's say in a cotton ball and put it directly on the wound, because to put the oil on the cotton ball and then rub it on your skin is not the normal way of rubbing the oil into your skin. So you'd only be allowed to rub it in the normal way. So if you usually don't rub it, but you want to put oil onto your skin, you could rub it in the normal way, by putting the oil directly on your fingers, whatever, and rubbing it right in. It's possible though that using a dropper, you're not going to get 100% of the oil out of the dropper, right? Maybe with Dr. Wishner here, you mix things up in the olden days more, but I don't think you're going to get 100% out. You're going to get 99.8% of it out. So is that considered wasting? Probably not. So this might be because, let's say, a cotton ball or something that absorbs, and then you want to rub that in. That's the stuff that gets absorbed is being lost. That's Shmita produce that's being lost. So perhaps using a dropper, something that's not absorbent, maybe that wouldn't be a problem. It depends what the reason is. I'm not. Actually, no. The reason he says it's not because of loss. He says you're not allowed to do it in a way that looks like it is for healing. So because people don't use a dropper, that's in the normal way. So that looks like it's refuah. So we're not allowed to do that on Shmita. I take that back. Olive oil, yeah. Yeah. On a wound. I guess maybe they didn't want the scarring or something. Right, cosmetic reasons, right. But I mean, I think they put it on their skin for cosmetic reasons also. Maybe it's good as a sunscreen. I don't know. If you have a headache or you have like lice or something, then you are allowed to rub your hair with Shmita oil. Okay, halacha zayin. Shemen shel shvius ein chos mebotana v'kirayim. You're not allowed to use Shmita olive oil to seal an oven or the different types of ovens. So I assume this means when you made a new one, they would coat it. I think I mentioned last week that I know specifically I heard that there are some pots from France that they coat with like lard to give it a seasoning and also the thing. So it's hard to, don't buy those pans because it's not clear that we could kasher them. But I said that there's a similar thing for Shmita. We're not allowed to, so these wouldn't be metal pans because maybe it would be, but these ovens that they have, you can't coat it with oil, I think, when you finish making them. The ein sachin bo mino v'sandal. You can't use it to oil a shoe or a sandal or a baseball glove. But it was before Abner Doubleday, so the Rambam doesn't mention that. Someone once, you see, Mike, you probably don't know, but someone who was a genius. Someone wrote a book about 20 years ago about it's called Glove Affairs, and it's about the history of baseball glove and how to work it in. They sent a copy to Pat Hughes in the Cubs booth, and he loved it so much he was quoting from it every day. It was like the best free advertising, So he spoke about the different oils or putting under the mattress and this and that, a history of the glove. So the ein sachnos abiyadayim tmeos, and you can't rub it even on yourself if you know your hands are impure. So in general, we consider our hands to be a sheni l'tuma, which is a very low state of impurity, but it means do natilas yadayim, like the way we do for bread. You do that, and then you rub the Shmita oil on yourself. But if oil fell on your hands, you could right away just rub it in with your hand, even though you didn't do Netilas Yadayim on your hands just now. You're allowed to rub it on your feet, but you can't rub oil into your feet while your shoe is on, because you're going to be oiling the shoe, right? You're allowed to oil your foot and then immediately after put it into the shoe. You can rub it on your whole body and then roll over a new leather mat. So you're not allowed. So that's not considered indirectly putting the oil into the mat. It's considered that you did your body and then whatever, your body happened to rub it off on something else. So that's not a trick that is forbidden. So Rav Kook says, it appears that nowadays that everything is in a status of impurity. This halacha doesn't even apply. So you wouldn't have to do Netilas Yadayim before rubbing it in. Okay, in regard to the shoe or the leather mat, even if it's new, that putting oil on the mat or the shoe is very good. It's part of making the final stage of making the leather good. It's still allowed to, meaning even when you're putting it on your foot and then putting your foot in the shoe. But you're not allowed to put oil on top of a tablet of marble to roll on it, because you're gonna lose some of the Shmita oil. Shemen sheshvias noso the garde haoreg lasuch beinas ba'oso. So this is interesting. So the people who would weave, I guess because they were picking the warp and the woof, they would need to have some moisture on their fingers, so they could have oil for that, because they would dip their fingertips in the oil. So even though a little bit's getting on the thing, but you're allowed to lubricate your body with it, so that's not a problem. But you're not allowed to put it into a comb. That if you were going to comb out, you had raw wool and you were going to comb it, you're not allowed to put Shmita oil into the comb, because that's not using it for human consumption. Okay, one last halacha for today, halacha ches. How are we allowed to use Shmita produce for lighting a lamp or a candle? Not a candle, but a light. You're allowed to light the flame in Shmita oil itself. But if you sold oil to someone else, or you even you traded oil with each other, then you're not allowed to use either of them for lighting. Because you're not allowed to use money that had Shemitah sanctity for lighting. So once there was a change of possession like that, then you are not allowed to because then it's not considered that you're burning the Shemitah produce. You had something that had Shemitah sanctity that you're only allowed to buy food with. You're not allowed to buy something for combustible reasons. You can't put it into a bonfire, but you light it in a lamp. So like for Lag BaOmer, everyone lights a big bonfire. You're not allowed to pour Shemitah olive oil onto the big thing of wood to make the fire bigger, but you are allowed to, I guess you would light it in a lamp and then maybe pull that out and put that on the bonfire. But again, that's to pour it like that onto a fire, meaning, or let's say a different way. The fact that you're allowed to light it is you put a wick into the oil and burn it. I can't put the oil onto the floor and light it, even if it's a bonfire. So perhaps that's the proper way to read the Rambam. The way to normally light it is you put the wick into the oil. You don't put the oil onto a fire. So if you would use Shmita for arson fire, you're doing multiple things wrong, not just Shmita related. Okay, the Pasa Shulchan says, based on the Gra, that if you sold Shmita oil and you bought other oil, you're allowed to, so this is a leniency from the Vilna Gaon, you are allowed to, meaning because with everything you're dealing is with oil. You sold oil and you bought other oil. You sold olive oil and bought olive oil, even though the Kedusha transferred to the coin in the meantime, you're allowed to, because Kishem Shanita, just like you're allowed to use oil of Shmita to light, you're the Kedusha that got transferred to the money was oil Kedusha. So then you could buy more oil to light with it. So it seems that according to the Gra, based on this Yerushalmi, shows that it's not just the general Shmita sanctity, but there is a little bit of nuance depending on what you read. If it was oil, this coin has Shmita oil sanctity. Now, obviously, you could buy real food with it. You could increase it, but you couldn't buy animal food with it. But if you use it, but if you would have bought, tomatoes with it, and then you sold the tomatoes, and you wouldn't be allowed to buy oil with the new money. What do you mean? So that's great. There's no restrictions. If you buy or sell that, there's no sanctity at all on the money, because sanctity only comes from buying a Shmita product. If you had that type of oil, you could also pour it on a bonfire. On Shmita, right now, I go to a store and I find that it was packed 2 years ago, or even 1 year ago, that we know it's not Shmita. None of these restrictions of oil apply. You can do whatever you want with it. Oh, no. So then, okay, so then you have made the non-Shmita oil into Shmita oil, because the sanctity from the coin now came into the oil. So the oil, which previously by itself was not Shmita, now it has Shmita sanctity. So that's a good question. Yeah, and that's the answer. But the thing is, if you sold wine or other food, then you're not allowed to buy oil. You have to buy other food. You can't buy oil that you're going to rub or light. To buy oil with it, that oil would be forbidden to see. If you did buy it, meaning you sold wine or vegetables, whatever, then if you bought oil, you're not allowed to use that oil for rubbing the oil into your skin or for fuel for your lamp, because it has all the statuses of the wine, which you're not allowed to light wine or whatever. And similar, if you exchanged oil for wine, you're not allowed to use wine for ziluf. I think ziluf is, they used to pour a little on the ground to make it smell good in the house. But no, you wouldn't be able to do that anyway. But once the oil, if the money originally came from an oil, but now from wine, you could only use the wine for regular wine purposes, not for stuff that were oil purposes. The only way to fix it is you'd have to exchange them for non-holy items, meaning for non-Shmita items, and then they come back to the original status that oil. Meaning, so if you bought it, you would have to somehow, if you sold wine, you bought oil, the oil you could only use it for cooking, really, in a normal way to fry or saute your food. But you can't use it for your candles or for rubbing. So the best thing, you'd have to somehow sell it for regular thing, and then it becomes back to original olive oil of Shmita, which can be put in a lamp, lit in a lamp, or rubbed into skin. Okay, and we are a few minutes late.